Good afternoon. Thanks for all of you joining us here today. I know it's been a long day, so welcome to this press conference by Mr. Richard Bennett, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan. He'll deliver brief remarks and then we'll take your questions. He has just now, a couple of hours ago, or not even that long, presented his latest report to the General Assembly's Third Committee. With regard to the situation of women and girls, the report details the ongoing and intensified restrictions imposed by the de facto authorities. It also includes information on concerns pertaining to sexual and gender-based violence and protection and participation of women and girls. Mr. Richard Bennett was appointed the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan in April 2022. He has previously served in Afghanistan on several occasions and in different capacities, including as Chief of the Human Rights Service with the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA. Special rapporteurs, as you know, were independent experts, part of what we call the special procedures of the Human Rights Council. And now I'll stop talking. Mr. Bennett, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Laura, and good afternoon to everyone here in the room. And all online as well. Thank you for your interest in the human rights situation in Afghanistan. As Laura said, I just presented my report to the General Assembly's Third Committee, and I'll expand here on the wide variety of human rights concerns that are tormenting the people of Afghanistan. But also on the practical steps that need to be taken to change this, including here in New York. After more than 3 years of Taliban rule, my report concludes that the human rights situation continues to worsen. Some positive developments are being claimed in certain areas, such as counter-narcotics and security, are being undermined by the Taliban's actions, as well as by their more aggressive tone that appears to increasingly assert national sovereignty, rejecting their international human rights obligations, as well as denying cooperation with my mandate and access to the country for me. The delegates in the Third Committee uniformly condemned the Taliban's position, especially on women and girls, and supported my mandate and called for my access to be restored. I've concluded that the Taliban system of gender oppression amounts to gender persecution and is described as gender apartheid by many Afghans, a term that should be codified. Afghanistan remains the only country in the world in which girls and women cannot enjoy education above grade 6, and that's for more than 3 years now. Women are affected by the Taliban's restrictions in all aspects of their lives. Recently, a new so-called vice and virtue law further institutionalized an expanding list of restrictions that blatantly violate the rights of women and girls. This law, in fact, impacts the entire society, also affecting men, LGBTI community, religious minorities, and journalists, as it infringes on their cultural rights, religious freedoms, and freedom of expression. I am conducting an official study mandated by the Human Rights Council on this law to be released in February next year. My current report also highlights how civic space is shrinking even more. The pressure, exclusion, and sometimes targeted attacks that ethnic and religious minorities face, particularly Hazara, increases in corporal and capital punishment, and all amidst a serious and enduring humanitarian crisis in which humanitarian aid providers are confronted by restrictions from the Taliban and shrinking funds from the international community. Today, I called on all member states to unify, to to devise, adopt, and implement a comprehensive, coordinated, human rights-centered action plan. The international community should leverage the Women, Peace and Security agenda, build on last November's independent assessment on Afghanistan, and use the authority of both the Security Council and the GA, noting that the GA will issue a resolution on Afghanistan during its 79th session. The current failure to take such an approach has already emboldened the Taliban. We need to make sure that they understand that there are consequences for grave human rights violations. Demonstrable improvements in human rights are a prerequisite for any normalization, as was indicated in the independent assessment. But there's no silver bullet. Not one of these actions will work alone. An all-tools approach is needed. Therefore, I provided the General Assembly with a list of urgent and practical actions that should be undertaken, including the meaningful inclusion of Afghans, especially Afghan women, in political processes and diplomatic engagements, funding and support for Afghan human rights defenders and humanitarians, and ensuring survivor-centered pathways to justice. Thanks. I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Mr. Bennett. We'll begin with Ibtisam.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My name is Ibtisam Azim, Al-Arabi Al-Jadid newspaper. If you could elaborate on what you said regarding human rights action plan. How do you see this happening and compared to what is happening now? Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I've been talking about an all-tools approach for quite a while. And interestingly, others are now also speaking that language. So there needs to be an action plan in relation to accountability. And we have seen, finally, some action in that 4 countries have lodged a dispute with Afghanistan under the CEDAW Convention, which may end up in the International Court of Justice. Other forms of accountability include the ongoing investigation at the International Criminal Court. I call also for the use of universal jurisdiction. And I also want to highlight here that countries that were involved in Afghanistan, in the long war in Afghanistan, and who themselves have violated human rights, ought to make themselves accountable or be held accountable as well. So that's on the accountability side. I'll also call for a strengthening of documentation. I do undertake documentation. I have a mandate for that, which is the bedrock of all human rights accountability, and including perhaps additional mechanisms or measures. I also noted the independent assessment. The independent assessment, which was positively noted in the Human Rights in the Security Council, and where the Council called for a special envoy, seems to have moved rather slowly in terms of its implementation, and this did set out the need. It was a kind of roadmap. It set out the need for benchmarks, and those benchmarks should be on the rights of women and human rights. So I am in favor of assisting. I'm willing to assist them in favor of developing those specific benchmarks that could be markers, very much in consultation with Afghans, especially Afghan women, for the gradual normalization of Afghanistan. There should be no normalization until verifiable, measurable benchmarks have not only been agreed, but have been implemented. Another part of the action plan that I'd propose would be the full inclusion of Afghans, of all Afghans, in discussions about the future of their country, in particular non-Taliban Afghans, and especially among them, members of civil society and women. So these are some of the elements of an action plan which is yet to be developed. It's my proposal, but these are a few suggestions.
Thank you. Let's go to Marian and then Abdul Hamid.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bennett, for your time and being here. I have so many questions. I don't even know where to start, but I'm going to ask what people are asking from within the country. Do you think the international community basically became numb towards what's going on in Afghanistan and what women are experiencing on the streets of Kabul, Herat, Nangarhar, in every single province in Afghanistan? We don't see any action. All we see and witness is talking. You see Security Council basically not on their agenda. It's all about Gaza, Lebanon, Ukraine, and all these escalations in the Middle East. And nobody talks about Afghanistan anymore. There's a gender apartheid going on, and nobody even support the gender apartheid campaign. Women are working so hard. What do you say about this numbness of the international community towards Afghanistan, and how does that affect Afghan people, including women? I have one more question, but I'll let you answer this one first. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your question, Marianne. I mean, there are so many terrible situations around the world right now that I think you're right, that Afghanistan has often been moved to the margins. But in none of those other crises are women and girls treated the way they are in Afghanistan. Half the population is basically erased from the society. And so I think it's a big challenge for these agendas that have been around for a while: women, peace and security, feminist foreign policy. Where are they? What can they really do? So there was this one thing a few weeks ago that I mentioned, which is that some countries have decided under the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, there's a clause allowing countries, state to state, to challenge Afghanistan's violations under that convention that could end up, maybe fairly quickly actually, within months, at least less than a year, in the International Court of Justice. There is a possibility of that. So that is the first thing that I'm aware of that goes beyond just mere words, mere condemnation. And I fully agree with you. The impact of the words but no action, I think, on Afghan women, and I can see quite a few sitting in the audience, is that they feel disregarded. And they are so brave and so resilient and will never give up. So it is time. And it's not only that this is the only country where schools are closed, for example. It's just one example for girls above 6th grade. It's that there was such a huge international commitment and investment in Afghanistan. And Afghans, I've been involved with Afghanistan for 20 years, and Afghans always knew that would end at some point, but they didn't expect it to kind of end in such a hasty way that they were abandoned and still feel abandoned.
Follow-up. You talked about your action plan, and you said all tools should be used regarding Afghanistan. There's been talks about conditioning aid or sanction the Taliban because of what they are doing in Afghanistan. There is humanitarian concerns on one side, and then also what's going on in regards to human rights and women's rights in Afghanistan. Do you think if the international community came together and put more pressure on the Taliban, that would be more impactful instead of just sitting there silent or once in a while just publish a statement, not even a resolution? We haven't seen any resolution when women were banned from going to universities, schools beyond 6th grades, or after the Taliban literally banned women from getting aid to other women, just completely removing them from international humanitarian aid organizations. No resolution has been passed since then. So conditioning the aid or new sanctions on the Taliban, and what would you say about that? And also, you are banned from going to Afghanistan. How's that affecting your work currently? Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks for those questions. I think what I've said about the international community vis-a-vis the Taliban is that the Taliban have a clear ideology. They have a goal. They're wanting to establish their version of Islamic emirate, and they highly value unity. When we think about the international community, they don't have any of those things. They don't have a goal. They don't have a plan. That's why I'm saying there should be a plan that's human rights centered, and they're not cohesive. When it comes to the issue of conditioning aid, I'm somewhat cautious about that because there is already dwindling aid going into Afghanistan. There's less money, less contributions, and so it's the people of Afghanistan that are suffering. I do agree, however, that the aid that goes in should be very careful. There should be very careful oversight. There should be guardrails to ensure that it goes to the people that need it most, and not to other people. So those, and on the terms of sanctions, there is an exemption for humanitarian aid and basic human needs. I support that, as I've said, but there are also travel bans on some individuals in the Taliban leadership, and I think that could be continuously reviewed in terms of extending them. Thank you. Oh yeah, I am banned from traveling, as I mentioned, both in the Human Rights Council a month or so ago and here today. Many delegates, many countries called for that ban to be revoked. I hope that it is revoked. But in fact, I want to say it doesn't really affect a lot of my work. I am able to do documentation, to interview survivors, witnesses. I'm able to reach into Afghanistan remotely, meet people face-to-face outside the country. And so while it would be advantageous to go to Afghanistan, it's also somewhat risky for people to talk to me in Afghanistan and to be seen to associate with me, so that there's pros and cons with this, and it will not stop me being committed to the people of Afghanistan and continuing to table reports like the one I've presented today.
Thank you. Go ahead, Abdul Hamid.
Thank you, sir. Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. I just have one comment before I ask my question. I was in Afghanistan myself, and after the collapse of Taliban, and I met a woman there who became later famous, and she ran for president. She told me that if the Americans make the same mistakes they did in 1989, Taliban will be back. She said that, and that she was so accurate. Now, 20 years under the U.S. Occupation, or what do you want to call it, and they committed so many crimes also, which turned all the Afghan people against foreigners. You know, this country had defeated the three empires, the British, the Soviet Union, and the Americans. So my question about the mistakes committed by the other side. When Taliban took over, they promised so many good things. They said, we will open it up, will not allow our country to be used as a terrorist base, we'll have an inclusive government, we'll treat women nice. But what turned them completely 180 degrees isn't there is also some blame to be placed on the other side when they froze the Afghan assets immediately, cut off their relation, didn't recognize them, didn't invite them for dialogue? My question is, how can you divide the blame and on the playing, on the parties playing in the affairs of Afghanistan also? Thank you.
Yeah, I agree that there should be responsibility and accountability for all parties to the very long conflict of 45 years since 1978 in Afghanistan. You remember that certainly the Americans were there, but before that the Soviets were there as well. And you mentioned the British too. It goes back 100 years and more. And so my view, and I speak from human rights perspective, human rights violations did not start in August 2021. And responsibility for those and accountability for those ought to be broad-based and ought to involve all parties to that conflict. So I'm very much in favor of what I've sometimes called national inquiries, where states that were involved reflect on their involvement and do something about it. I think we're seeing a number of reflections, but again, not much action. It could result in criminal sanctions. In other countries, we've seen in Australia at least one prosecution, and perhaps reparations to those Afghan communities that suffered from all parties to the conflict. So I do note that, and I think in the world today, it's important to avoid double standards and to ensure that human rights and sanctions for violating human rights are applied equally across the board.
Do we have any additional questions?
Just if you address the issue of freezing the assets.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, as you know, some of them, half of the assets, there's around 7 billion altogether. Half of them are here in the US. They're still subject to litigation, I understand, and that's not resolved. The other half were transferred to Switzerland jointly, and there is a board or a committee that is responsible for dispersing those assets. I think it's been going for almost 2 years now, and we haven't seen progress as far as I know. So it's a good question. It's perhaps not exactly a human rights question, but I think it's a fair question to ask. I'm probably the wrong one to give an answer. That question is probably directed to either the US or Switzerland.
Thank you. I don't see any questions online or on the floor. So with that, Mr. Bennett, thank you very much for your press conference. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you
Have a
very
good
much.
day.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks, everyone, for coming.